It was supposed to be the kind of weekend kids remember forever. Balloons floated above the crowd. The scent of popcorn mixed with cotton candy drifted in the August air, and laughter echoed from the top of the Ferris wheel down to the carousel. Greenview Amusement Park was in full swing that Saturday afternoon. 12-year-old Ava Chandler had begged her parents to let her go, not because she loved rides, but because her little cousin Bella was turning 8, and it mattered to her. She wasn't the kind of girl who liked crowds or chaos. She liked sketching, soft music, quiet corners, but she loved her family. So, she went. There's a photo taken that morning, the last clear one anyone has of her. She's wearing a pale yellow t-shirt with tiny sunflowers on the collar, her hair pulled back in a loose ponytail. She's smiling, standing next to Bella with a party hat tilted sideways on her head. It's hard to look at now. Behind the smile, no one saw anything unusual. Nothing in Ava's expression suggested fear or discomfort. To everyone around her, it was just another happy day. They arrived around 10:15 a.m. The group included Ava, her mom Lauren, her aunt Michelle, and 5 kids total. As they moved from ride to ride, Ava stayed close, cautious, observant. At around 12:40 p.m., after the group finished lunch near the main plaza, Ava reportedly asked her mom if she could go to the nearby candy stall, just a few feet from where they were sitting. Lauren nodded. It was broad daylight. The area was packed. She watched Ava walk away, weaving through other kids toward the stall tucked under a striped red canopy. She never saw her again. At first, no one panicked. Ava had a habit of getting distracted by details. She could spend 10 minutes just watching the fountain or tracing patterns in gravel. So they assumed she wandered off. But 20 minutes passed, then 40. Lauren's voice rose. The calls to her name turned sharp. Staff were notified. The group split up and checked bathrooms, gift shops, behind snack carts. They were still thinking rationally, still thinking, this is a big park, she'll turn up. But by 2 p.m., the fear had started to creep in. An employee radioed security, who responded with the kind of practiced calm that made Lauren want to scream. They said kids wandered off all the time. They suggested checking the lost children tent. When she wasn't there, they expanded the search, slowly, methodically, like they were going through a protocol more than reacting to a crisis. Park officials didn't call local police until nearly 3:30 p.m., and by then, more than 3 hours had passed since Ava was last seen. Security footage from the plaza cameras later confirmed Lauren's version of events. Ava walked toward the candy stall. She stopped briefly beside a claw machine. Then, she stepped out of frame behind the Ferris wheel structure and never reappeared. What's chilling is that there was no visible sign of a struggle. No one followed her on camera. No one led her away. She simply vanished. And in a park with nearly 4,000 visitors that day, not a single witness came forward to say they'd seen a girl matching her description leave the area. As the sun dipped behind the roller coasters and families began heading home, Ava's parents stood frozen near the entrance, refusing to leave. Officers were now swarming the park. Loudspeakers made announcements asking guests to check for a missing child in a sunflower shirt. Drones began to scan the perimeter. Dogs were brought in before sunset. But in the eyes of investigators, something was already lost. Time. The first hours after a disappearance are critical. Every minute matters. And in Ava's case, the clock had been running far too long before the right people were even notified. By nightfall, the park was closed, sealed off as a crime scene. The Chandler family was taken home in silence, their house now a war room of grief and confusion. Ava's bed remained unmade. Her sketchpad lay open on her desk. A half-drawn face, unfinished, stared back from the page. The next morning, search teams would comb through the woods surrounding the amusement park. Helicopters would circle above. Reporters would camp outside the Chandler house. But none of that had happened yet. For now, there was only silence, and a mother's voice in the dark, whispering her daughter's name into the void, hoping she was still close enough to hear. The first 48 hours after Ava's disappearance became a blur of movement, but no direction. By Sunday morning, Greenview Amusement Park was no longer a place of laughter. It was a closed crime scene surrounded by barricades, news vans, and exhausted officers. The air was tight with urgency. Helicopters buzzed above as search teams formed grids across the surrounding woods. Volunteers from neighboring towns arrived with bottled water, flashlights, and hope. But for Ava's parents, Lauren and Greg Chandler, time had already begun to twist into something cruel, moving forward on the clock, but backward in answers. They hadn't slept. Lauren refused to leave Ava's room that night. She clutched her daughter's stuffed elephant and stared at the ceiling, replaying every second from the park. Greg, silent and tight-jawed, sat in the living room with detectives. He wasn't asking questions. He was trying to listen, to absorb every possibility. Neither parent believed Ava had run away. There were no arguments, no warning signs, no hidden behavior. Her sketchbook was still filled with drawings of cats and birthday cards she planned to make. There was nothing in her life she wanted to escape from. By early Sunday afternoon, both Lauren and Greg had been brought in for formal interviews. It was standard. The parents are always questioned first. Then came the polygraphs. Both passed. No signs of deception, no inconsistencies. They were cleared quickly, but the ELOT process left something behind. A subtle fracture in trust between the family and the investigators. Greg had expected police to arrive with theories. Instead, they came with forms and procedures. He started to wonder if they really knew what they were doing. By Monday morning, over 200 people had joined the search effort. Drones were deployed to sweep the heavily wooded terrain behind the park. Sniffer dogs, led by trained handlers, worked through the park's interior. One scent trail, faint but distinct, was picked up near the Ferris wheel, the last place Ava was seen. It led across the staff service path, through a maintenance corridor, and stopped at the edge of the staff-only loading docks used for delivery trucks and equipment. Then, nothing. No trail beyond that point, no footprints, no clues, just a hard stop. This detail disturbed detectives more than anything. The scent ending there suggested only two possibilities. Either Ava had been lifted into a vehicle, or she had been led into a structure with a closed air system. Either way, it pointed to coordination, knowledge of restricted access. And that meant someone familiar with the layout of the park. Investigators turned their attention inward. Employee lists were pulled, schedules cross-referenced, background checks began in bulk. Over 140 employees had worked that weekend: food vendors, ride operators, janitorial staff, tech teams. Everyone was questioned, some multiple times. A few stood out. One ride operator had left mid-shift due to a family emergency and couldn't immediately be reached. Another had prior complaints for following young guests too closely. Still, no direct connection to Ava, no clear suspect. Surveillance footage, which might have offered a breakthrough, instead delivered frustration. While the Central Plaza and ride entrances had decent coverage, many of the rear park cameras showed issues: pixelation, frame skips, corrupted files. Detectives brought in digital forensics to examine whether it was hardware failure or intentional tampering. No conclusive answer was found, but the coincidence raised internal alarms. Someone might have known exactly where the blind spots were. Despite growing suspicions, nothing concrete emerged. No ransom call ever came, no demands, no text messages or phone pings from Ava's smartwatch, which was found in her backpack at home. She hadn't taken it with her. There were no fingerprints out of place, no signs of a struggle, no dropped belongings. It was as if she had stepped into thin air. By Monday night, reality began to set in. The news cycle had picked up the story. Photos of Ava, that bright smile, those curious eyes, were now circulating online. Hashtags trended. Strangers sent prayers. But on the ground, momentum was already slowing. Tips were flooding in, but most were vague, unverifiable, or clearly false. One man claimed he saw her at a gas station 30 miles out. Another insisted she was in a white van. All dead ends. Lauren began to pull away from the investigators. She sensed their doubt, their shifting tone. Greg grew impatient, asking sharper questions, demanding quicker action. The cracks widened. The worst part was, they still had no idea what they were dealing with. An accident? A predator? Someone from inside the park? As Tuesday approached, the first 48 hours ended without a single solid lead. No one had seen Ava Chandler leave the park, but something, or someone, had. And if she had been taken through the loading docks, someone had to know, someone who had the access, someone who planned ahead, someone who was still silent. By the end of the first week, the focus had narrowed. No longer a frantic, wide-net search across surrounding counties, the investigation honed in on a single location, the amusement park itself. Investigators now believed whatever had happened to Ava, it likely didn't begin outside. It began inside. Somewhere between the candy stall and the staff-only loading docks, something, or someone, intervened. That stretch of ground, barely 70 yards across, became the emotional and forensic epicenter of the case, and all eyes turned inward. 3 employees immediately drew suspicion. First was Devin Hales, a janitor in his mid-20s who worked cleanup shifts in the eastern quadrant of the park, which included the Ferris wheel plaza. His record was sealed, but investigators learned through quiet channels that Devin had a juvenile history, something serious enough to require legal clearance before being hired. Still, his background check had cleared. He claimed he had been on break during Ava's disappearance, but camera logs showed a 45-minute gap where he was unaccounted for. No digital badge swipes, no alibi. Then there was Ethan Moreno, a food vendor stationed near the arcade who abruptly left his shift around 1:15 p.m., roughly half an hour after Ava vanished. He told his supervisor he had a migraine and drove himself home. Police found it odd that he didn't mention seeing or hearing anything unusual, especially given how close his cart was to the scene. He wasn't listed in the first round of interviews, and by the time police followed up, he had retained a lawyer and declined to speak further. The third was Sarah Gentry, a ride operator responsible for the bumper cars. During her initial interview, she said she had been on break in the staff lounge from 12:30 to 1 p.m., a time frame that would place her far from Ava. But another employee later recalled seeing her outside, walking alone near the Ferris wheel, the exact time Ava disappeared. When confronted, Sarah claimed she had been stretching her legs and must have forgotten, but the contradiction raised red flags. Still, without physical evidence or a witness placing any of them with Ava, there was little detectives could do. No arrests were made. The park itself became a point of national outrage. What had once been a family staple was now flooded with protesters, conspiracy theorists, and furious parents. The close Greenview trended for days. People wanted answers. Local news ran exposés on safety violations, inadequate camera coverage, and understaffed security teams. A whistleblower from inside the park claimed certain cameras had been offline for weeks prior to Ava's disappearance, but management allegedly failed to address the issue. Whether this was negligence or something darker was still unclear. Under mounting pressure, the park announced it would shut down temporarily, though no reopening date was set. Within days, fences went up. The once colorful signs were stripped. Employees were furloughed indefinitely. It had become more than just a crime scene. It was now a symbol of something broken, something unsafe. And in the middle of it all was a missing 12-year-old girl whose face had become unavoidable. Ava's photo circulated across every major network, every social media platform. She was no longer just a name. She was a national image of heartbreak. Her round cheeks, deep hazel eyes, and quiet smile appeared on missing child posters taped to store windows across the country. TikTok sleuths began posting timeline breakdowns, theories, even maps of the park. Rumors spread like wildfire, claims of secret tunnels underneath the attractions, suggestions of a trafficking ring using the park as a cover, allegations that a park executive had fled the country. None of them checked out. None of them helped. For the Chandler family, the noise only deepened the silence. Lauren stopped watching the news entirely. Greg tried to stay engaged, hoping some online post would lead to a clue, but it quickly became overwhelming. Their house felt suspended in time. Ava's room remained exactly as she'd left it. Sketchbooks still open, watercolors still drying. Her favorite hoodie, the green one with the fraying sleeves, still draped over her desk chair like she'd be back any minute. But days were turning into weeks. Investigators ran down every theory, chased every tip, and circled back to every employee flagged in the initial sweep. But nothing stuck. Backgrounds checked. Alibis, weak as some were, technically held. No physical evidence linked anyone to Ava's disappearance. No new footage surfaced. It was as if the trail had already gone cold, inside a place built for joy, in broad daylight, surrounded by thousands. What unsettled detectives most wasn't just the lack of answers. It was how quiet everything became after. Ava hadn't run. She hadn't screamed. She hadn't left a single trace. And that kind of disappearance, the kind that leaves no sound, no mess, no panic, almost never comes from chaos. It comes from planning, from someone who knew the blind spots, someone who had access, someone still hiding in plain sight. By the start of the third week, the Chandler house was filled with a silence so dense it felt alive. The initial chaos, the search crews, the media vans, the kind neighbors dropping off meals and reassurances, had faded. What remained was a void, a stillness that echoed through the rooms where life had once moved normally. For Lauren Chandler, that silence was the worst in the morning. She'd wake with the same half-second of peace, the same instinct to check if Ava had kicked her blanket off in the night, and then it would hit, that she hadn't slept in her bed, that the blanket was still exactly where it had been for 21 nights. The national media moved on quickly. Ava's story, once on every channel, had now been replaced by newer headlines. Lauren had once taken comfort in the coverage, believing that if enough people saw her daughter's face, someone somewhere would recognize her. But the attention came with its own cost. The internet had no shortage of theories. Some accused the parents. Others claimed Ava had run away. Strangers dissected Ava's expressions in old photos, looking for signs of something no one had seen. Lauren eventually stopped watching completely. Every comment felt like a new kind of cut. Greg, on the other hand, couldn't let go. He began compiling everything: maps of the park, employee shift logs, construction blueprints, old inspection records. He barely slept. He argued with detectives, questioned timelines, rewatched the same broken security footage until the images blurred. He latched onto a theory that someone had accessed the underground service corridors that ran beneath part of the park, insisting that Ava had been moved through there. Detectives told him the area had been searched. He didn't believe them. His obsession began to fracture what little normalcy they had left. Lauren pulled back, retreating into herself. Friends stopped coming by. The house became a pressure chamber. Tips still came in, dozens of them. One woman swore she saw a girl matching Ava's description boarding a Greyhound bus in Denver. Police followed up. It wasn't her. Another tip claimed she'd been spotted at a motel in Nebraska. Same outcome. Dead end after dead end. Then came the psychic, an older woman from Arizona who claimed Ava had appeared to her in a dream. Said she was in a cabin in the woods, near water, possibly held by someone she knew. She gave a vague sketch of a man's face. Detectives followed up, more out of obligation than belief. They found a hunting cabin that fit the description near a lake 3 hours away. It was empty. Clean. Nothing to tie it to Ava. No evidence. Another nothing. Back at the Greenview Police Department, lead investigator Marcus Lane began to re-interview witnesses, starting with employees who had initially seemed peripheral. The case file had grown too thick to navigate cleanly, so he went back to basics. Who had been near the Ferris wheel? Who had unrestricted access to the loading docks? Who had gaps in their timeline that were never fully explained? One name resurfaced that made him pause. Devin Hales, the janitor. Devin had been among the first employees interviewed. He'd claimed he was on break, sitting in a storage room near the main gift shop. Nothing about him had stood out, until now. When Lane requested an updated list of staff, he noticed Devin was no longer employed at the park. He'd quit 2 weeks after Ava's disappearance, giving no notice, not even collecting his final paycheck. Park HR listed his file as voluntarily resigned, but no one from management had seen him since his last shift. A uniformed officer was sent to the last known address listed in his file. The apartment was empty. Neighbors said he'd moved out in the middle of the night, a week earlier. No forwarding address, no contact. It didn't confirm anything, but it didn't sit right either. Investigators began digging into his sealed juvenile record, pushing for a court order to access the details. Whatever had been hidden in his past now seemed worth re-examining. Greg, who had been quietly collecting his own suspicions, had already flagged Devon's name. When he heard the janitor had quit without warning, something in him hardened. He became more convinced than ever that the park had hidden something, that someone on the inside had helped, but every time he pushed too hard, he was told the same thing: circumstantial, unprovable, and without evidence, there would be no arrest, no charges, no resolution. Lauren didn't know what to think anymore. She sat most nights in Ava's room, the lights off, door barely cracked open, staring at the shadows. The police weren't calling as often. The updates had slowed to a trickle. All she could think about was that moment, those 5 minutes when she let Ava go alone to a candy stand, in daylight, in a place they thought was safe. It had been 3 weeks, 21 nights, and still nothing, no clue, no sightings, no sound. But something had changed. A janitor had vanished, a man with no clear reason to run. And for the first time in days, there was something new to follow. It was a Monday morning, 23 days after Ava Chandler disappeared. Just after 6:30 a.m., a janitor named Roy McKinney was making his usual rounds at the Southridge Community Gym, a modest aging facility mostly used by high school athletes in weekend leagues. It had been closed the night before for maintenance, so Roy was the first one in. He liked the silence, the way the echo of his footsteps filled the long, narrow hallway that led past the locker rooms. He moved without urgency, pushing his mop cart, same as always. But something caught his attention when he reached the back wall of the girls' locker room, locker 38. The door, slightly ajar, tilted just enough to make him pause. That locker hadn't been assigned to anyone in over a year. Curious, Roy opened it fully. At first, he thought it was empty. Then he saw it. Tucked into the corner, a single piece of lined notebook paper, torn at the edge, folded once. He wasn't the kind of man to snoop, but the way it was placed, deliberate, waiting, it made his stomach twist. He opened it. 5 words, shaky and rushed, written in what looked like a child's hand. "I'm alive. They watch me. Don't stop." He handed it off to the front office within minutes. By noon, it had reached the Greenview Police Department. The detectives, already stretched thin and grasping at nothing for weeks, reacted instantly. The gym was only 5 miles from the amusement park. The timeline was tight. The possibility that Ava had written this herself was too loud to ignore. The locker was secured, the area was sealed off, and the note sent straight to the lab for forensic analysis. No name, no date, no indication of who had left it or when. But it didn't matter. For Lauren Chandler, there was no doubt. She knew the way her daughter wrote. The loops in the lowercase e. The slight hesitation before finishing the tale of a why. She had watched Ava write countless thank you notes, grocery lists, and entries in the little journal by her bed. She didn't need a lab to tell her what she already knew in her bones. Still, the detectives did what they had to do. They gathered samples from Ava's school notebooks, art pads, anything with her handwriting. A handwriting specialist compared the note to Ava's entries from the months leading up to her disappearance. The results came back with a phrase that investigators rarely use unless they're sure: high probability of authorship. But it wasn't just about the handwriting. Partial fingerprints were lifted from the paper, smudged, incomplete, but still enough to run through databases. The system came up empty. Not Ava's, not in any known record. If she had written the note, someone had likely handled it after her, or before her. The uncertainty opened more questions than answers. Was she forced to write it? Had she hidden it, hoping someone would find it, or was someone planting it as a trap? Investigators reviewed gym access logs. The security system was outdated, and the cameras inside the locker hallway didn't cover the back row. But the exterior footage showed 3 employees entering after hours on the Friday prior. 2 had alibis confirmed through time-stamped texts and security badge logs. The third? A night shift maintenance worker who had been hired only a month earlier, just days before Ava vanished. His name wasn't unfamiliar to the team: Hector Reeves, a former ride technician at Greenview Amusement Park. He had quietly left his position a year earlier after budget cuts, then reappeared at the community gym. No priors, no red flags. But there was something about the timing and the overlapping connection to the park that felt too coincidental. Detectives requested an interview. Hector was calm, cooperative, claimed he didn't know the locker had been used, said he hadn't seen the note, explained that. He was tasked with air filter checks on the upper vents, nowhere near the locker rows. When asked about his previous employment at the amusement park, he simply nodded, saying he'd worked the East Side rides but had no involvement in park operations since. His GPS data placed him near the gym during the hours in question, but nothing placed him directly inside the locker room. His prints didn't match the ones pulled from the note. There was no surveillance of him entering that hallway. It was just a suspicion, a ghost of a link, and it wasn't enough. Still, for Lauren and Greg, it was the first flicker of movement in weeks. The note became the center of their world. Lauren clung to the words, "I'm alive." The phrase ran like a current through her brain on repeat. She reread it nightly, sometimes hourly, imagining the fear in Ava's hand as she wrote. Greg didn't share her clarity. He questioned everything. What if it was faked, a cruel trick? What if Ava had written it weeks ago and the trail was already cold? What if it wasn't her at all? But the handwriting, the gym's location, the connection to the park, it was too much to ignore. Something had changed. The silence had been broken, and someone out there wanted them to know, or wanted them to believe. Either way, the investigation had a new center. Locker 38 was no longer just a storage space in a dusty gym. It was a message, a whisper from the dark, and it meant Ava might still be out there. The note had changed everything. In 5 short words, "I'm alive. They watch me." The entire case had shifted. What was once a static disappearance had new gravity, a pulse, a possible sign that Ava Chandler was not only alive, but being held against her will. Investigators moved fast. The handwriting had been all but confirmed, and the location, an unused locker in a gym just 5 miles from the amusement park, was too deliberate to be dismissed as coincidence. So when the gym's employee roster surfaced and one name stood out, it took less than an hour to escalate. Hector Reeves. He wasn't a stranger to the investigation, but no one had considered him seriously before. On paper, he was ordinary. A 37-year-old maintenance worker, no criminal record, no disciplinary issues, no digital footprint that raised red flags. But the deeper detectives looked, the more unsettling the profile became. Hector had previously worked at Greenview Amusement Park as a ride technician until he was laid off the year prior to Ava's disappearance. His job had granted him access to restricted areas, including the underground service corridors and mechanical rooms not open to the public. That in itself didn't prove anything. But when his GPS records were subpoenaed and reviewed, a pattern emerged. On the day Ava disappeared, Hector's personal vehicle was logged just 2 blocks from Greenview at 12:36 p.m., a detail that hadn't been uncovered in the early days of the case. He didn't clock in at the gym until his usual shift that evening. When questioned, he claimed he had simply driven through the area to drop off lunch to a friend working in retail nearby. The friend, when reached, said she hadn't seen Hector in months. The lie wasn't subtle. It was deliberate. Still, lying isn't a crime, and the absence of hard evidence left detectives boxed in. So they brought Hector in for questioning. He arrived without a lawyer. Calm, casual, his demeanor unnerved the officers in the room. He answered every question politely, claimed he had no idea who Ava Chandler was, said he didn't know anything about the note in the locker or how it got there. When asked why he'd lied about his whereabouts, he shrugged, said he didn't want to be dragged into something he had no part in. But detectives weren't convinced. One of them, Detective Marcus Lane, had seen this kind of stillness before. The kind of person who doesn't need to run because he's confident nothing can tie him to the truth. They asked about his past, where he'd lived before, who he'd worked for. That's when another connection surfaced, one that hadn't been in his file. 5 years earlier, Hector had lived in a small town in northern Michigan, the same town where, in 2018, a 9-year-old girl named Delaney Shaw vanished from a public fairground. Her case had gone cold. No suspects, no leads, but the details were hauntingly similar. Delaney was last seen walking toward a restroom near the Ferris wheel. There was no video footage, no confirmed witnesses. A scent trail had led search dogs toward a utility shed. Then, nothing. Her backpack was found 2 days later, inside a janitorial closet in a nearby recreation center. The room had been cleaned the week before by a contracted maintenance crew. No one was ever charged. Hector Reeves had been working that contract. Investigators pulled the old case file and began cross-referencing timelines. The similarities were chilling. But correlation isn't evidence. And when prosecutors reviewed what had been gathered so far, GPS pings, a vague employment overlap, a locker note with no direct link, they agreed. It wasn't enough, not legally. Hector couldn't be arrested, not yet. When Lauren and Greg Chandler were told, something inside them cracked. Lauren didn't speak. She just nodded, slowly, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Greg, on the other hand, exploded. He demanded answers, screamed that this man had walked into their daughter's life and slipped away untouched. He wanted Hector arrested, exposed, chased until something broke. But the law doesn't work that way, not without proof. Still, Hector was now at the center of everything. Surveillance followed him. His trash was collected. His movements were monitored. But he never slipped, never confessed, and he never returned to the gym after that interview. His resignation was submitted quietly, no reason given. He moved out of his apartment a week later, left no forwarding address, just gone. Detectives were left with a haunting trail that stopped short of the finish line. A man whose past and present aligned too closely to be dismissed, but who left behind no fingerprints, no DNA, and no confession. All they had was a note, 5 words scrawled on a scrap of paper in a locker no one used, and a mother, staring at that paper night after night, whispering to herself the only part that mattered. "I'm alive," she clung to it, not as a clue, but as a promise, even if the man who might have known more had disappeared into silence again. As the weeks dragged on and leads grew colder, detectives turned back to the beginning. Every missing child case has a point where investigators must choose between moving forward or starting over. With Ava Chandler, the answer was clear. They'd missed something. The note in the locker had reignited pressure from the top. And if Ava truly was alive, still being watched as she'd written, then whoever was behind this had been careful. Too careful. Which meant they likely hadn't left things to chance. They had covered their tracks. And it was time to revisit the one thing the investigation had initially accepted without question: the surveillance. The amusement park had claimed early on that several cameras near the Ferris wheel were corrupted. Glitches, faulty wiring, routine tech failure. It wasn't uncommon, but it had always left a hole in the timeline. Now, with more time and pressure, detectives weren't willing to accept that story anymore. They obtained the raw footage logs, not just the video but the metadata, digital fingerprints buried in code. And that's when they found it. Not technical failure, not hardware damage. The corruption was manual. Someone with internal access had used a system backdoor to selectively erase or overwrite camera feeds during a precise 37-minute window. The timeline matched exactly with Ava's disappearance. That changed everything. A third-party data recovery firm was brought in, experts who specialized in reconstructing deleted or damaged digital footage. It took days. The fragments were out of order, degraded, and stitched together in a way that made full recovery impossible. But what they managed to pull changed the direction of the case again. From a side-angle camera near the bumper cars, at 12:46 p.m., a small figure is seen walking alongside a taller one. The child is wearing what appears to be a light-colored shirt. The taller figure is wearing a dark hoodie pulled up over their head, face turned away from every available camera angle. The two pause briefly at a maintenance gate, normally locked, before slipping into a tunnel access door that led beneath the park. Then the feed cuts out again. Investigators froze the footage, zoomed, adjusted light. The child's build and gait matched Ava's. The timestamp matched the moment her trail had gone cold. There was no sign of force, no struggle. She followed. Willingly, it seemed. But who was the figure leading her? No identifiable features, no badge, nothing clear enough to confirm. Still, it was the first visual clue that someone had moved Ava out of sight, on purpose and with access. The images were released to the public within 24 hours. 2 grainy stills. Ava, or someone resembling her, stepping into a shadowed tunnel. The tall figure, mid-step, body turned just enough to see their height, but not their face. The tips came pouring in again. Most were noise, but one stood out. A former maintenance technician who'd worked at Greenview 5 years earlier called in anonymously at first, then agreed to meet in person. He claimed that during renovations in 2017, a series of small rooms were built beneath the east side of the park, meant to be temporary storage, but never removed. One, he said, was different, not listed in inspection logs, no door number. He called it the Black Room. It was soundproofed, built with a heavy door, and only a few senior techs had the key codes. It wasn't part of any public record. When he asked why it was there, his supervisor shrugged it off as a VIP safe room for bad weather, though it didn't meet safety codes and was never used for drills. Detectives requested updated blueprints. Nothing showed the room. No mention of the space existed in city permits. But the older blueprints, buried in a planning office archive, showed a blank square under the east maintenance corridor. No label, no access path, just empty paper. They returned to the park, now sealed and quiet, patrolled only by a hired security firm. The smell of rust and old sugar lingered in the air. The team searched for nearly 6 hours before finding it, beneath the bumper cars through a crawl space that hadn't been disturbed in years. Behind a stack of rusted chairs and a broken vending machine was a concrete wall, unevenly patched. The sound behind it was hollow. They broke it open. What they found was a small room, no larger than a supply closet. Plywood walls, a stripped mattress, rope fibers on the floor, a child's sock, faded and covered in dust. It looked abandoned. Forensics moved fast, but time had erased most of what could be lifted. No fingerprints, no blood. But there were markings, scratches on the walls like fingernails dragged along wood. No camera, no light. The room had no airflow. Whoever had been inside wouldn't have lasted long without being moved, which meant if Ava had been held there, it wasn't permanent. Just the first stop. The room proved what investigators had long suspected. Someone with access had used the park itself to make her disappear. Someone who knew which cameras to avoid, which doors to unlock, which places no one would ever check. But the question that lingered, even after the door was unsealed, was why? Why build a space like that in the first place? And more urgently, if Ava had been there, where had she gone next? Because whoever had built that room hadn't built it alone. Beneath the glossy surface of the park, under the roller coasters and game booths and worn-down popcorn stands, was a world most guests never knew existed. A sub-basement sealed off more than 2 decades earlier, long forgotten by corporate owners and buried under layers of renovations and liability paperwork. But not everyone had forgotten it, and when detectives followed up on the tip about the hidden black room beneath the bumper cars, what they found didn't stop there. It led further, past the illegal crawl space, beyond the forgotten safe room, deeper into something older, something colder. The sealed door was behind a rusted breaker panel, bolted and painted over. It took 2 hours just to pry it loose. What lay beyond wasn't on any modern blueprint. No recent employee even knew it existed. The original construction notes, pulled from dusty city archives, suggested it was part of the emergency storage complex built in the early 90s, a backup operations hub meant for storm evacuations and electrical reroutes. But it had been closed in 2003 after an electrical fire caused structural damage, a fire that had reportedly destroyed most of the records detailing what was inside. But it was still there. The air was thick, stale with years of decay. The stairs descended steeply into darkness. Water pooled along the cement floor. Mold crept across the walls in patches. But what caught the investigators' attention wasn't the smell or the silence. It was the markings. Graffiti that didn't match the time period. Tags dated as recently as 2021. Empty soda cans, candy wrappers, a broken folding chair. Someone had been down there. They moved room by room. It was a maze. Concrete chambers with rotted-out equipment, a few rusted maintenance carts, an old ride control panel covered in soot. Then, in the back hallway, they found it. A small area that looked recently disturbed. Not clean, not fresh, but clearly touched. The floor was swept in places, as if someone had attempted to cover their tracks. And in the corner, behind a pile of discarded wooden planks, was a mattress, stained, torn, child-sized. Nearby, a crumpled granola bar wrapper, a juice box, a broken zip tie, rope fibers in the dust, all modern, all within the last few months. They brought in cadaver dogs. Nothing. No scent trail, no alert. Whatever or whoever had been there, they were long gone. But the forensic team didn't stop. Soil samples were taken. The snack wrapper was tested. A single partial fingerprint was lifted from the juice box, but it was too smudged to match. No DNA, no conclusive evidence, just circumstantial proof that someone, possibly a child, had spent time in that space. And they hadn't been alone. The working theory emerged quickly. Ava had been held here, not for long, maybe hours, maybe a night, but long enough for someone to try to make her invisible. The space was perfect for that. Out of sight, off the books, and forgotten by nearly everyone, except perhaps someone who had worked in the park long enough to remember when that door wasn't sealed, someone who knew the old layout, someone who knew which shadows the cameras never reached. But that led to a deeper, more unsettling question. How many people could that possibly include? And of them, who had access, motive, and the willingness to use a place like this? Investigators revisited employee rosters dating back to the early 2000s. They looked at old contractors, electricians, ride engineers, anyone who might have had a reason to go underground and never report what they saw. Several names resurfaced. One had moved to another state, one was deceased, one had no fixed address, but all of it remained speculative. There was still no direct link to Ava, no camera footage placing her there, no blood, no hair, no clothing, just a feeling. A cold certainty that whatever had happened to her had passed through that space. Greg Chandler visited the site himself, against the recommendation of the detectives. He stood at the foot of the stairwell, looking down into the dark, and said nothing for several minutes. Lauren didn't go. She couldn't. She said if Ava had been there, if she had slept on that filthy mattress eaten from those wrappers, then she didn't want that to be the picture burned into her mind. She needed to believe Ava was somewhere else, still moving, still reachable, still writing notes in shaky handwriting and leaving them behind. Back at the station, a map was drawn, connecting the candy stall, the tunnel door, the black room, and the sealed sub-basement. It formed a path. A trail through the bowels of the park, each point connected by access no guest would ever know existed. It painted a chilling picture. This wasn't an impulsive abduction. This was deliberate, layered, planned, and if someone had taken Ava through all that, then they likely knew what they were doing. And they likely weren't alone. But the trail ended in the dark, below the surface, in a space no child should have ever seen. 7 days after investigators broke open the sealed sub-basement beneath the amusement park, just as momentum around Ava Chandler's case was beginning to fade again, a call came into the emergency dispatch center in Willow Creek, a small highway town 200 miles north. It was just after 1 a.m., and the caller was a long-haul truck driver named Ed Bailey. He sounded rattled but clear. He said a young girl, around 12 years old, maybe younger, had approached him outside a rest stop. She looked scared, dirty, and she was wearing red pajamas. Ed told dispatch she walked straight up to him, no hesitation, and asked if he could take her somewhere safe. He said her voice was low, shaky, like she hadn't spoken to anyone in a while. He reached for his phone, told her he was calling the police, and that's when she froze. He described the moment as eerie, like a switch flipped in her head. She turned, bolted across the lot, and disappeared into the dark tree line that bordered the highway. By the time local police arrived, she was gone. At first, it was treated like a routine runaway sighting. Nothing connected it to Ava. But when the details reached Greenview investigators, one word stood out: pajamas. Red pajamas. Lauren Chandler had told detectives early on that Ava's favorite pajamas, the ones with the tiny white stars on them, had gone missing from her drawer after the park trip. It hadn't made sense at the time. Why would Ava pack pajamas for a day trip? It was a small detail, and in the chaos of everything else, it got lost. But now, it took on a different weight. Detectives immediately requested CCTV footage from the rest stop. The exterior security camera, mounted on a pole facing the parking lot, had captured a partial view. In the grainy footage, a small figure is seen standing at the edge of the lot. She walks slowly toward the gas station, glancing over her shoulder. Then, a large man, presumably Ed Bailey, enters the frame. They speak for a moment, no audio. Then, the girl jerks back and runs, her body partially turned. Her face never shows, but the clothing is visible. A matching red pajama set with long sleeves and pants. The footage couldn't confirm identity, but it was enough to send a mobile team from Greenview North immediately. Drones were launched, bloodhounds brought in. The wooded area behind the rest stop stretched for miles, dense, cold, and scattered with old hunting cabins. The girl hadn't been seen since the night of the call. And after 3 full days of combing through the woods, searchers found nothing. No footprints, no clothing, no campsites. Whoever she was, she had vanished again. Lauren watched the footage herself, over and over, the way the girl moved, the way she hesitated before running. She couldn't explain it, but she knew, something in the posture, the panic. It was Ava. She didn't need a clearer image. She didn't care about the face. She knew how her daughter ran. But the realization came with a cruel twist. Ava had been close to help, and she'd run from it. That thought consumed Greg. If Ava had been out there, alive, why wouldn't she stay? Why wouldn't she scream for help? Unless she couldn't. Unless she'd been told not to. Investigators started to explore a disturbing possibility. What if Ava was being coached, conditioned, kept near but under strict psychological control? Children in abduction cases had been known to distrust adults, to fear the police, to run from the very people trying to save them. It wasn't far-fetched, it was a tactic. And whoever had her might have known exactly what they were doing. The next few days brought a flood of false leads. People claimed to have seen the girl at diners, at bus stations, near border crossings. None checked out. The face from the CCTV image was never recovered. The trees offered no clues. But Lauren refused to let go. She began writing letters. To the girl in the red pajamas. Letters she read aloud in nightly Facebook videos, pleading gently like a mother reading bedtime stories. Telling her daughter that it was okay to be scared, that she wasn't in trouble, that whatever they told her wasn't true. Police increased digital surveillance in the region, tapped into missing persons reports from neighboring counties. Still, there was no sign of a girl traveling alone or with anyone matching a profile. Whoever had her, if it was Ava, was good at staying hidden. Too good, which made the question even harder to ask. Was someone helping them, sheltering them, keeping her hidden in plain sight? By the end of the week, the sightings stopped. The leads dried up. But Lauren's hope didn't. In her heart, the detail of those pajamas was too specific, too tied to home. And while no one could prove it, she believed her daughter had made a choice to ask for help, even if fear took over in the next second, even if she ran, even if she was pulled back into silence. For the first time in over a month, Ava had almost made contact. And that meant the door was still open, just barely, but open. By the time the leaves had started to change and the air took on the chill of early autumn, 4 months had passed since Ava Chandler vanished from Greenview Amusement Park. The initial media frenzy had burned out, the news crews had moved on, the flyers were sun-bleached and curling at the edges. For the public, the story had begun to settle into that quiet category most missing person cases fall into eventually. A mystery with no resolution, just questions suspended in air. But for the Chandlers, and for the handful of detectives who had refused to give up, something still pressed at the edge of everything. The note. I'm alive. They watch me. Don't stop. The original paper remained in evidence, sealed in plastic, stored alongside fingerprint reports, time logs, witness statements, and fragments of failed leads. But the words themselves had never left the center of the case, and now, months later, they returned, this time digitally. It started in a small, heavily moderated message board dedicated to cold cases and missing children. An anonymous post appeared in a thread about Ava's disappearance. The username was scrambled. The IP traced to a public library in Ohio. The message was short. They still watch me. No name, no context, no follow-up. At first, moderators flagged it as a hoax. Trolls weren't uncommon in these forums, but something about the language caught attention. It mirrored Ava's note, not just in words, but in tone, in the way it begged without asking. 2 weeks later, a second message appeared, this time on a lesser-known true crime subreddit, again anonymous. This time, only 4 words. They watch me. Still. That one was dismissed quickly. Users debated if a TT was a cruel joke or someone mentally unwell. But the detectives watching, especially Marcus Lane, felt something familiar. The spacing, the phrasing, it was like hearing an echo in a dark room and knowing it came from someone you'd heard before. Then, a third post surfaced on a private Discord server dedicated to unsolved child abduction cases. It was a voice message, 8 seconds long. The voice was soft, young, and only said one thing. Don't stop. Please. Audio experts were brought in. The recording was analyzed. There was no background noise, no identifiable dialect markers. But the pitch range and vocal tone were consistent with Ava's age at the time of her disappearance. Lauren Chandler listened to it once. Just once. She didn't cry. She just nodded slowly, like she'd heard something she recognized, not in the sound itself, but in the fear behind it. But again, no evidence tied any of the posts to a location. The audio was traced to a VPN out of Ontario. The 2 text posts came from devices that hadn't been seen online before or since. Investigators couldn't rule out a hoax, but they also couldn't explain how someone outside the case would know the precise phrasing from the note, which had never been fully released to the public. The phrase, "They watch me," had been withheld. Only, "I'm alive, don't stop," had been quoted in press briefings. So where did it come from? That question stirred debate inside the department. Half the task force believed it was someone toying with them, maybe even the abductor, someone trying to stretch the pain a little longer. The other half believed it was her, Avenue. Still alive, still under someone's control, reaching out in the only way she could, carefully, quietly, from somewhere just beyond their grasp. But with no suspect, no location, and no traceable data, there was nowhere left to go. The file was marked inactive. Leads stopped being prioritized. Ava Chandler's name was added to the registry of long-term missing juveniles. Case number 2271, GVA. Her face still sat in the system, updated with age progression software every year, but the team had been reassigned, the funding had been cut, there was nothing more they could do. The amusement park reopened under new management just before Halloween. A new name, new signage. None of the previous staff returned, the bumper cars were relocated, the underground tunnels were sealed with concrete, families came again, the children laughed again. But beneath it all, some locals still whispered about the girl who had vanished and about the door that used to lead somewhere dark. Back in Ava's room, nothing had changed. The posters on her walls had faded slightly, the watercolors on her desk had dried. Her favorite green hoodie still hung from the chair where she left it. Every night, Lauren turned on the lamp beside the window, just in case. Not because she believed Ava would walk back through the front door, but because she wanted her to know. If she was out there, she was still being waited for. Sometimes Greg would sit by the front steps long after midnight, staring at the street as if the headlights from the next car might mean something. But the cars always passed. The silence always returned. And the message, the one left behind in a locker, in a voice, in a line repeated across the internet, remained the only thread tying them to her. They never heard from her again, but they never stopped.